Lyn Price. She's a professional genealogist who's been doing genealogy for 15 years and has a master's degree in history. She loves sharing her passion for social history and genealogy, as understanding the social and historical context in which the ancestors lived really helps bring the ancestors to life. Welcome, Louisa.
Thank you. And that's why I'm here to talk about epidemics, because all of your ancestors lived. Some of them may have died in an epidemic. Are we good back there? And you can all hear me? Okay, so we're going to start with doing something a little bit different. I want you all to close your eyes. And I'm going to read you a scenario, and I want you to really try to be there. Think of what you're seeing, what you're smelling, what you're hearing or not hearing, and how you're feeling. So this is Boston. It's the autumn of 1721. You are in Boston, home to 11,000 people. On a normal day, the port would be bustling with incoming and outgoing ships, merchants, and men loading and unloading cargo. The markets would be filled with women seeking out the freshest produce. Men and women would frequent the merchant stores. But this was no normal day. In April, the ship called the Seahorse brought smallpox into Boston. At first, there were only a few cases. The red quarantine flags were hung on the doors of houses with smallpox, and an armed guard enforced the quarantine. As spring turned into summer, however, the number of houses with quarantine flags increased rapidly, and some streets appeared to be under martial law with all of the armed guards. Soon, as the smallpox spread, quarantine ceased to be enforced. The government moved to Cambridge. About 1,000 people with the resources to leave fled in early summer. Those without resources were forced to remain and hunker down amid the growing terror. Supplies dwindled as farmers who supplied the butter and grain stopped deliveries, fearing they would catch the smallpox. Other critical supplies, including firewood, were also not being delivered. Many of the merchants fled. So many stores were closed. But you wouldn't venture there anyway, unless they carried something you desperately needed. Few people ventured out. If you did, you would give anyone you passed a wide berth and look at them suspiciously. They would do the same to you. You might see people holding handkerchiefs to their noses and mouth. Amulets of garlic adorned the necks of passersby. You also would try almost anything, no matter how bizarre it might seem, to avoid contracting the smallpox. In early July, rumors spread about Dr. Boylston and Cotton Mather purposely infecting people with the smallpox. They said it was to stop the smallpox, but how could that be? Other physicians in town strongly condemned the practice, while many clergymen supported it. On July 24th, the selectmen ordered Boylston to cease the practice. He refused. A newspaper and pamphlet war escalated between those who supported Boylston and those who did not. Smallpox continued to spread and the number of deaths began to soar. It seemed nothing could stop the spread of the disease. By autumn, 50% of the city had been inflicted. 1 in 7 of those inflicted had died. There were many deaths each week. So you can open your eyes now. What were you thinking, feeling? Tell me what was going on as I was reading that. You're thinking everything was dirty? Anything else?
Anytime they get food.
How did they get food? It was the struggle.
It would have been frightening unless you know what we know now about vaccines and things like that.
It would have been frightening unless you know what we know now about vaccines and all of that. Anything else? I hope that you were able to feel at least a little bit of the terror that was there, the uncertainty, because this is what it was like. This was a real epidemic. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but this was one of many epidemics to hit colonial New England, and there were other epidemics of other types that would also hit throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. So this epidemic that we were just talking about is smallpox. This girl is severely inflicted with smallpox. You can see all of the boils and pustules throughout her body. And when you get smallpox, for the first 3 days, you have a fever of over 103, so a very high fever, intense headaches and vomiting, pains in the back and the loins. And by the 3rd or 4th day, a rash starts, which then turns into the boils that you can see here and spreads to the entire body. In the 1700s in England, it was probably a 15 to 20% mortality, whereas in the colonies it might be more of a 10 to 15%. So it's a little better if you're in New England, but still Many of you would die if you were to get it. And for those who survived, some of the complications would be blindness, disfigurement. You hear a lot about the pox. So the boils leave all kinds of marks on your face. You have a very pocked face. And also could be sterility. So not a good disease to have. So does anyone know who this is? Cotton Mather. What do you know about Cotton Mather? Minister? The son of Increase. Yeah.
And he was very scholarly. He had a lot of connections with scholars, ministers in Europe.
So, okay, I'm going to summarize where you are so far. So he's very scholarly. And this is the part that I wanted to get to, is that he's very scholarly. So he was a minister. He is perhaps most well known for his support of the Salem witch trials and having the trials go forward. But he also, in addition to being a minister, he was a scholar. And he was very interested in science. He kept up with the literature coming out of England and Europe. And he also would communicate with them back and forth. Sure.
His slave, right?
Yes, I'm going to get there. So, for reasons that you'll find out about in a few slides, he was very concerned when this epidemic hit Boston of smallpox, and he wanted to do something. And his slave and some of the literature coming out of England and the colonies said there might be something they could do, and they called it variolation or inoculation. And basically what you would do is, let's say that I'm sick and you're healthy, so you would take one of my boils, you would pop it, mix up the pus. You would then take your skin, so you're healthy, make an X, draw the blood, mix it up, and then take the pus from me that's sick and put it into your blood and mix it up with your blood so it will get into your blood system. So this is, you can see how controversial this would be. You're taking someone who's healthy and giving them smallpox. But so the slave who had come from a culture where they did this, and other slaves, same thing, had come from the same culture, and the literature coming out of Europe said that actually the mortality rates were far lower. If you self-inflicted people, they had a much milder case. They would get smallpox, but they would have a much milder case. So you can imagine as they were starting to do this in Boston, and interestingly, I think a lot of the clergy supported it, and the doctors did not. The doctors had two reasons. One is, why take someone who's healthy and make them sick? And two, the sickness could be a punishment from God. Who are we to try to, even if this does work, who are we to try to tell God that, hey, we can make people better? You'd think it would be the clergyman who would say that, right? So it's kind of interesting that they switched. But what happened, I'm sorry about this, is that Boylston continued, and by the time it was all over, people who got variolated, only about 2.5% of them died. Whereas those who got it naturally, from their family or docs or wherever, about 12 to 14% of them died. So you could say, hey, this is a success, right? That Boylston and Mather were right. And this remained very controversial, but it became more and more accepted throughout the 1700s. And actually, when smallpox broke out in George Washington's camps in the Revolution, he mandated that they get this variolation, or they also called it inoculation. And so this is something by Thomas Thatcher. It was published in 1677, and it was published after a measles outbreak in 1677. But it talked about, it's a brief rule to guide the common people of New England in how to manage themselves in smallpox and measles. So this is something that was written for the common folk about how to take care of yourselves if you have measles or smallpox. And so this is his advice. And I'm going to read, I know it's small, I'm going to read just part of it in number 8, where it says, see that their diet or medicines be not altogether cooling, but let them in no wise be heating. And so they're referring to the humors there. They believed back then in the humors, and that illness or health was caused by the humors. If you were healthy, then all of your humors were in balance. If you were not healthy, then one of them was being too strong, and you needed to tamp it down so that you would be in balance again. And my ideal balance would be different than your ideal balance, but that didn't matter. What mattered is for me that my ideal balance is being met. Humors have the properties of being hot and cold, or wet and dry. So you can see here where he's saying let your treatments not be altogether cooling. So they have a high fever, so it makes sense to try to cool them down a little bit, right? or to give them foods that are, or herbs that are thought to have cooling properties, not necessarily fever reducing, but getting something that's going to get rid of the extra hot humors. So he's like, let them be not altogether cooling, but certainly don't do anything to increase the hot humors. And so this is important because it's the first medical thing that's published in the colonies. So it was in 1677. So what about smallpox today? Well, there still is no cure if you were to get it. Best that medicine could do is a virus, so there's no antibiotics that they can give you. Best thing that they could do would just be to treat your symptoms and hope you pull through. Jenner did come up with a vaccine in 1796, which was an improvement over the variolation, because the variolation used live virus, vaccine uses dead virus. So, but it also, even though it was available, it may not have really been available because you had to be rich to afford it. And also it was not mandated that you do it. So it was kind of whoever wanted to and had the money could get the vaccine. So there were still outbreaks throughout the 1800s into the 1900s. It was eradicated worldwide in 1977. So now nobody has it. It's in a lab somewhere, but that's it. How many of you were vaccinated for smallpox? And do you have the scars to prove it? So I actually was born a few years too late. I did not get vaccinated for smallpox, but I've heard stories about the scars that you can get from it. So today there actually is no vaccination though because it's been eradicated. So we're going to move now to a different disease. So smallpox, I started with smallpox because it was the one that scared people the most. And the reason why that it scared people the most is you never knew when it was going to pop up. So there are diseases that are endemic, meaning they're always around. I guess there's a vaccination for childpox, or a vaccination for chickenpox now. There wasn't when I was a kid. So when I was a kid, chickenpox was endemic. You would get it as a kid, you might get sick, few people might die, but for the most part, you got it as a kid and then you didn't get it again. So, so that's what an endemic disease is. It's one that's always around. So in places like London in the 1600s and 1700s, smallpox was endemic. It was always around. If you were going to get it, you were going to get it as a kid. If you got it as a kid, a lot of you would die. But if you made it past childhood, you were going to survive. You weren't going to get smallpox because you'd already been exposed to it because it was always around. But it was an epidemic in Boston and the rural areas because there wasn't enough of a population to make it endemic. So it might come in the early years every 20 or 30 years to Boston. It might come every 30 or 40 years to some of the outlying areas. So the 30 and 40-year-olds could die just as well as the young kids because they hadn't been exposed to it before. So that's partly why it was so frightening, is because it could take anyone who hadn't been exposed to it. It was in New England was usually adults as well as children because it didn't come around that often in the 1600s and into the 1700s. So it was the most frightening one. This one, next one we're going to talk about, is the second most frightening one. So it started in a place called Kingston, New Hampshire, which is not very big. And there was a death on May 20th of Parker Morgan, who was an adult. And then the ones that are highlighted in yellow are where there were multiple children that died per household. So by the end of May, Jeremiah Webster had lost 3 of his children to what they were calling the throat distemper. They didn't really know what it was. And then in June, Ebenezer loses a son, Samuel loses a daughter, they each lose another one further in June, and then Joseph Bean's kids start dying. By the end of this, hundreds and hundreds of kids had died in about a year. And they understood contagion to some degree. Like they knew the smallpox was contagious and that quarantines could help with that if you were to isolate them soon enough. They didn't understand everything that we understand now. This throat distemper though, it popped up here, like in this part of town, and then it would pop up over there, and then over here. So it didn't seem to be, if it was contagious, you would think that, if it started here, it would spread from there, right? So they weren't really sure what to do about this. So there was no quarantine because it didn't seem to be contagious. What actually happened is that the minister and the doctor, you can be carriers of this without getting sick with it. So and of course, as kids were sick, they were going to go visit them. So they, without knowing it, were spreading it around town, and that's why it would jump from here, from here to here, is because it was being spread in part by the physicians and the ministers. So throughout the summer, the deaths continued in Kingston, and then they spread throughout New England, but not all of New England. It kind of skipped and hopped where it was going to go. And usually it was children who were affected, and usually if one child in the household died, multiple children in the household would die. In some towns, 50% of all of the kids died. Not just the kids who were sick, all of the kids in the town, 50% of them died. So as a parent, this is extremely frightening because a lot of the kids were dying, and what about your kids? And so the Reverend in Kingston, he said, God hath been provoked to visit this people with sore and grievous calamities. And the Kingston Church Records, so I'm not sure if this was him or someone else that wrote in the church records, this mortality was by a canker quinsy, which is a respiratory disease, which mostly seized upon young people and has proved exceeding mortal in several other towns, that it is supposed there never was the like before in this country. And in terms of children dying, there probably had never been something like this before. And so you can see this is something that Ernest Caulfield put together, and the information is in your syllabus. But he studied this a lot, and he put together probably an 80-page article about it. You can see that the deaths. So this is the annual deaths. You can see, that there was something going on here, but for the most part, there were about 10 deaths per year. Until all of a sudden, 1735, there's over 100 deaths. And 1736 is right here, there's 45 deaths. 1737, it takes until about 1740 for it to get back to normal. And most of these excess deaths were caused by the throat distemper, probably all of them. One of the things so once you started having symptoms, you could die within 12 hours. Others went through the whole sickness, seemed to be fine, were recovering, sitting up to play, and then they dropped dead. That's also really frightening because you think your kid survived, and then all of a sudden she dies. Some families lost all of their children. And one of the things that didn't help is that it was custom back then that if you were a kid and your childhood friend died, you would help prepare the body, you would help carry it to the cemetery. So it was being spread as you were helping to take care of your friend. You were getting it as well. So in 1735 and 36 in New Hampshire alone, there were 1,000 deaths. And 80% of them were for kids under 10 years old. Another 15% or so were 10 to 20-year-olds. And then there were a few adults that died. Many of these were pregnant women, or women who had just, maybe not so much pregnant women, but women who had just given birth, were weakened by that, they got this, and then they would die as well. And so if you look and see the deaths per 1,000, you can see that Maine and New Hampshire were the hardest hit. New Hampshire was by far the hardest hit at 75 deaths per 1,000. Maine the second with about 56 deaths per 1,000 people. And then Massachusetts and Connecticut were both hit much more lightly. And the doctors in Boston, they're like, well, we're really good doctors, and that's why people aren't dying of this here. Whereas you up in New Hampshire, you don't really know what you're doing. And we'll see that that isn't true in a little bit. So most historians today think that this was diphtheria. It's rare that historians will retro-diagnose something and be in agreement, but it's pretty clear that this is diphtheria. And so New York in in the next spring they wrote, no disease has never raved in New England except the smallpox, which has struck such universal terror into people. It has been among young people and children, pretty universal and very mortal. So not a happy thing. And the names for it say how terrible it was. It's called the strangling angel, or plague in the throat. What happens is it's a bacterial infection. The bacteria then creates this gray thick mucus, a toxin in the throat. And basically the person who's afflicted dies because they can't breathe, because there's so much toxin and mucus in their throat. So they basically suffocate, gasping for breath. There is sore throat and fever. As the disease progresses and there's more mucus, there's difficulty swallowing and breathing. During this epidemic, depending where you were, the fatality rates range from 16% to 60%. And 100 years later, 150 years later, Boston and New York both had outbreaks, and the fatality rates were similar. So this is a bad disease no matter when you get it. So some of the treatments. Well, confinement in bed and sweating. So with the humors, when you had an excess of humors, you wanted to get it out. And the more that you could purge, whether that was inducing vomiting or diarrhea or bleeding, sweating, anything to get it out, the more you could get out, the better in their minds, because you were getting rid of all of these excess humors. Of course, we think, well, they're probably weakening someone who's already weak by making them lose even more fluids. But so one of them was confinement in bed and sweating, tea with Virginia snake root, English saffron, and cochineal. Cochineal is a really expensive insect. It was used actually to dye the redcoats of the redcoats, and it was used for royal things. It also, because it was so rare and expensive, anything that's rare and expensive that you can add to your medicines are going to make it stronger and more potent because you're adding something that's rare. Also popular was a posset of milk thistle with wine, lapis contrariera, which is a rock that's expensive, and gascoigne powder, which is a cure-all. It's supposed to cure anything that you have. And then also purging. So these were some of the treatments that were in newspapers and elsewhere. This one actually was a reverend in Boston in 1740 who said this is how you should treat it.
Is there any, anybody ever try to figure out how many people would have died from treatment, like purging?
The question is whether anyone would have, does anyone ever try to figure out how many people would have died from the treatments, the excess purging? No, I don't think so. It's known that it happened. I mean, George Washington died, but he had a sore throat. Actually, he called it a throat distemper. It wasn't diphtheria. It may have been more than just a sore throat, but it wasn't diphtheria. But his doctors were trying so hard to revive him that in the end they bled, I think it was 1 to 2 liters of blood in a 24-hour period, and that's what killed him. So we know that it happened. It happened. I don't know if it was super common, but no one's really studied that as far as I know. So this Boston physician, N.H., who thinks that he knows everything because he's in Boston and they're not being affected by this, although they still have it, they're not having the death rates. He says, well, you need to bleed them. So open a vein under the tongue, and if you don't do that, then anything else you try is just not going to work. And then bathe the mouth and throat with borax or honey. We know that honey at least does have some antimicrobial properties, so that may have helped. And then apply this, I'm not even going to try to say it, but it's an ointment of marshmallows. Apply it to your throat. And it's just like a paste. So marshmallows is a plant. So it's not the marshmallows in the store. It's a plant. So it's like any other plant, that you would stew it or whatever you would do to make it into a paste or an ointment. So some of the complications of diphtheria is heart damage. Remember those kids who seemed to get better and were playing and then all of a sudden fell dead? It was because of heart damage. Their heart had been damaged and nobody knew it. There's also nerve damage, paralysis, lung infections. Lung infections, like pneumonia, are never a good thing as a secondary infection. They're going to have a pretty high mortality rate. So what about today? Well, in the US, diphtheria peaked in 1921 with more than 200,000 cases and more than 15,000 deaths. So this was only 100 years ago. There was a 20% mortality rate for kids that were young, and then also for 40 years or older, which would be most of us in this room. If you were 5 to 40, the mortality rate was lower, and the share was about 5 to 10%. Vaccinations began in the 1920s. And so the last major outbreak in the US was in 1971, but really as soon as the vaccination started and people started taking the vaccinations, it started going down. With treatment today, there's a 10% mortality rate, and treatment would mostly be antibiotics to get rid of to get rid of the bacteria so it's not creating that thick toxin. But without treatment, there's still a 50% mortality rate today. The question is, if you survive, do you get an immunity? I think so, but I can't swear to that. Vaccinations or what? What is what? His question is, what, since it peaked in 1921, could that be related to soldiers returning from World War I? It could be. Very well could be. Also, I mean, I don't know how much higher it went, say from 1918 or 1914 to 1921, but we do know it started going down once vaccinations were available, which we would expect. So this guy named Shattuck, who was today we would call him an epidemiologist, who was in Boston or Massachusetts in the 1850s, he put together the causes of death in Massachusetts from 1842 to 1848. And so we can see that about 28% of them were zymotic diseases up at the top. So all of everything in this list sums to 100. So about 28% of them are zymotic diseases, which are what we today would call contagious diseases. But another 30% were respiratory diseases, and almost all of those would have been tuberculosis. They didn't consider it contagious at that point. So in the 1840s, out of all of the deaths, about 50% of them were due to contagious diseases. And that number in that number in Massachusetts didn't drop below 20% until the 1920s, and not below 10% until the 30s or 40s, as more and more vaccinations started to become available. And as we started to understand the difference between bacteria and viruses and how to treat them. So now let's look for those zymotic diseases. What were the most common ones? This isn't going to work. So dysentery, so these numbers here don't sum to 100, they sum to the 30%. So it's actually more than 4% that died of dysentery, but it was probably like 8 or 10%. But anything related to diarrhea was going to be a big killer because you were losing so much fluid and they didn't have the capability back then to replace that. Today you can go and get an IV, you're not getting just water, you're getting the electrolytes, and they didn't have that back then. So anything related to diarrhea would be a big killer. Also there was typhus fever, which is different than typhoid fever. So typhoid fever is water or foodborne. So if you, Typhoid Mary, who kept passing it on, that was foodborne. Typhus fever, we'll talk about a little later, is something completely different. And then also we see whooping cough, we see influenza, measles, and then the third killer was scarlet fever, at least in this time period, in these 6 years. So let's talk briefly about some of the respiratory diseases you might see. They had the common cough and cold that we have now. They had measles, which used to be endemic, but as people choose not to get vaccinated, we hear more and more, especially college students, who are now getting measles. Whooping cough, I have a friend who's a pediatrician, and so you can't, so there is a vaccine for whooping cough, but you can't get it until you're 2 or 3 or 4. You can't get it when you're a baby, and that's what really affects the most, and she's seeing a big increase, and it really worries her that all of these babies are coming in with whooping cough because people, again, around them are choosing not to get vaccinated. We've already talked about diphtheria, and we will talk about tuberculosis, and we'll touch briefly on influenza. So measles. A lot of these diseases have the same symptoms: high fever, runny nose, sore throat. You have white bumps in the mouth, and then a rash that develops 3 to 5 days after the fever starts. And you could die from this. It wasn't a huge killer like smallpox and diphtheria, but you could die from it. Also, you could get diarrhea. That could lead to death. You could get pneumonia. That could lead to death. And also it could cause blindness and then encephalitis, which is a swelling of the brain. So let's talk about an outbreak in Boston. This was in the 1680s, and this was Samuel Sewall. So Samuel Sewall, again, probably mostly known for being a judge in the Salem witch trials. But so in January, his son Sam falls ill, and then Eliakim falls ill. His daughter Hannah becomes sick. And then about 2 weeks after his first son fell ill, he says, "The measles come out pretty full on my dear wife. She was very ill in the night." On January 24th, the physician tells Samuel Sewall, the father, that he also has measles. And then none of them die, all of them recover. And February 7th, he says, "This day my wife, Sam, and self purged after the measles." So they're better now, but they really want to make sure this is gone. And so they're going to purge. And normally when you're talking about kids, the purges are generally milder. And you notice that his 8-year-old daughter doesn't purge because they understand that you have to be careful with kids with purging. And now let's move to 1713. So this now is Cotton Mather's house. So Increase on October 18th becomes moderately sick. Nibby, who was 19, is very ill. About a week later, his wife then gives birth to twins. His daughter Katie is ill, but she recovers after a very severe illness. His wife then gets sick with the measles. His daughter Nancy is sick. His daughter Lizzie is very sick. His daughter Jerusha becomes ill, and then the deaths start. His wife dies, his newborn twins die, and Jerusha dies. So his 3 youngest children and his wife die. This is in 1713. This was 8 years before the smallpox epidemic, where he really, really wanted to try variolation. You can see why. He was the only one in his family not to get sick, and this is because he'd been around during an epidemic earlier and had gotten it then and survived. But you can see what motivated him in 1721 after seeing every single one of his family members get sick, many of them very sick and 4 of them dying. And so he decides that he, again, wants to tell the common people like you and me how you can care for your kids, your wife, your husband when they get sick. And he says the measles are a distemper, and a distemper really is just an illness. They're a distemper which in Europe ordinarily proves a light malady because it's endemic, it's always around. If you survive childhood, you're not going to die of the measles as an adult. But in these parts of America, it proves a very heavy calamity because both kids as well as adults can die because they haven't been exposed to it before. So a malady grievous to most, mortal to many. And because the sickness is now spread in all parts and its malignity increases in the winter, then I'm going to give you some advice about what you can do. So, and it's a very long list, and it's in your syllabus if you want to look at it. If you have a cough, then he says, okay, do the usual things. Take a spoonful of shavings of cast-iron soap and a glass of wine or beer. This is a very popular remedy for a few nights, and it has been proven, according to him, for the cure of that inconvenience, a cough. But if a flux follow, which is diarrhea, which is common, so the common flux is diarrhea, or bloody, which is diarrhea with blood, then make a tea of rhubarb and sweeten it with a syrup of marshmallows, again the plant, not the candy, and give it daily, so much as to cause 1 or 2 stools. So this person already has diarrhea, so they're already purging in a way, right? You're not trying to purge them. In this case, you don't want to purge them more. You want to actually try to stop the purging, not stop it, but slow it down so that they have 1 or 2 stools a day. And the same tea will also carry off the worms that is so often follows the measles, especially in children. So, added benefit. And then a purge would be necessary for all that would not have the venom of the measles remaining in them, and followed with many evil consequences. So remember how Samuel Sewell and his wife and his son purged? This is why. I mean, they lived about 40 years earlier, but it's the same idea. You want to make sure there's no venom remaining in you. So this is a graph that might be a little bit hard to read, but it helps to show how far the epidemics are. So this is measles. So in about 1670, there was an outbreak, and you can see that the y-axis is 35, meaning the previous outbreak had been 35 years in Boston. So it's 35 years between this one here in the 1670s and the previous one. The next one occurred about 33 years later, but you can see how quickly it drops down to by 1750, there's about 20 years. Are you following me, how this works? In between epidemics. And by the time you get to 1800, it's about somewhere between 5 and 10 years. So at that point, it's becoming much more endemic than epidemic. And the same would be true for some of the other diseases as well, that the time in between the outbreaks or epidemics increases to fall. Does that make sense?
Yeah, as it becomes more endemic, are there fewer deaths?
So as it becomes more endemic, are there fewer deaths? I would guess probably not. I'm guessing no. I'm not 100% sure. There's not really a good way to track this stuff. It's hard to track. The reason I would guess no, though, is because medicine hasn't improved. So there hasn't been a big improvement in medicine. It's just that it's more of a guarantee that once you survive childhood, you're probably good to not catch one of these diseases. But you have to survive childhood, and we know that childhood mortality was pretty high. So here, our good friend Ernest Caulfield has also wrote a big long article about measles, and he put together the death rates for measles. And you can see that this is in the 1700s into the early 1800s, ranges from about 100 to about 600 death rate per 100,000, depending on the year and the place. Seems kind of high. But, and for reference, he says, well, because he was writing in the 1940s, he's like, well, in 1942, the US death rate, annual death rate was 0.3 per 100,000. So this seems really high. But keep in mind that by 1940, it was endemic. This is an annual rate. So even though in 1714, there might be a lot of people that die in New London, there's not going to be a lot of people that die for the next 40 or 50 years until the next epidemic comes. So you got to keep this in mind. It still is high. We were doing much better in the 1940s, but it's not as different as it looks because it wasn't endemic. I don't know. 1772, what would have been going on then? In 1759? I'm not actually sure.
59 is what during the French War.
Okay, so,
So soldiers in war obviously.
yeah. Okay, so it could be, okay, so, okay. So there are two very good possibilities that were just raised by audience members. One is that 1759 was in the middle of the French and Indian War, and then the 1772 was not long before the Revolutionary War. So soldiers and troop movements spread, and camps of soldiers spread disease. The second one is the Acadians. Some of them were, when they were deported, some of them were deported to Massachusetts, and some also to Philadelphia. Refugees that are in crowded conditions, that they don't live in a house, they don't have clean water, all of those things is also going to cause disease to spread. So those are possibilities. There could be other reasons as well.
Philadelphia was growing too, a great deal, and had a lot of immigrants. Well,
At that-
yeah,
yeah.
it would take in Boston.
Yeah, I think so.
Had, I mean, a lot of Germans, lots Irish, you know.
So,
I don't know if that would have an effect on
So also mentioned there was a lot of immigration, and again, more people coming in, tighter conditions could spread it. There could be a lot of reasons why.
all of those are ports too, there's a lot of shit.
I'm sorry, what?
All of those are ports.
Yes, and actually, often when these diseases came, they came from Europe or from the Caribbean in a ship. So these are all port cities as well. So lots of reasons why. And so today, the vaccine measles didn't become available until later than many of the others. It became available in 1963. Prior to that, there were about 3 to 4 million people in the US affected each year. About 400 to 500 died, so it's not really a big killer. I know out of 3 to 4 million people, only 400 to 500 died, but there were a lot of people who were hospitalized. So now moving on to scarlet fever. So scarlet fever is a lot like diphtheria with one big difference. The main difference is that, well, there's two main differences. Scarlet fever has a much lower mortality rate, and it has a distinctive rash that people with diphtheria don't get. So, remember that those Boston doctors said they were doing so much better and they knew how to treat their patients better? There was not diphtheria in Boston. There was scarlet fever. So they were comparing something that already had a low mortality rate to something that they said was the same, but it wasn't, that had a much higher mortality rate. So they weren't as much better as they thought they were. And this is, yeah, so the symptoms are sore throat and fever. There could be vomiting, there could be abdominal pain. There's a whitish coating on the tongue, and the strawberry, like you can see on the tongue, it almost looks like a strawberry. That's distinctive. The throat and tonsils get red, swallowing can be painful. I don't know, I think there is a little bit of the toxin, but not as much. You're not going to suffocate usually from scarlet fever. But there are a lot of complications of scarlet fever. Different types of fevers, kidney disease, ear infections, pneumonia, arthritis. There are a lot of bad things that can happen if you survive, if you get scarlet fever and survive. So we're going to talk just really briefly about whooping cough, that it feels like a cold for 2 to 3 weeks, and all of a sudden it becomes this very, very deep cough, or maybe not deep, but where you're coughing so hard that all of the air in your lungs goes out. And so the whooping sound is when you're trying to get the air back in. We're trying to breathe in air. And it can be pretty violent. Like some people vomit because they're coughing so hard. And it's most dangerous to babies. 50% of them that get whooping cough need to be hospitalized, which is never a good thing to be in a hospital if you're a baby. Some of the complications in babies are pneumonia, which can be a big killer, convulsions, apnea, which is trouble breathing, encephalopathy, again, the brain swelling, and then death. So tuberculosis. Tuberculosis has actually been around for a long time, but for whatever reason, it became much more prominent, or at least much more noticed, in the 1800s. That's when you really first start hearing about it. And one of the names for it is consumption. Before the 1800s, you might read, that so-and-so died of consumption or had consumption. Before the 1800s, that could be any respiratory disorder. It wasn't necessarily tuberculosis. But by the 1800s, when you said consumption, you were generally talking about tuberculosis. And the reason it's called consumption is because literally you waste away. It's a terrible disease to have. If someone in your family had it, you would watch them waste away. Remember that it wasn't counted among the zymotic or contagious diseases. It's because it wasn't realized until the 1900s that it really was an infectious disease, that you could get it from someone else. So you would have difficulty breathing, you would have fevers and sweats, a loss of appetite. If you're not eating, you're going to waste away more. Your skin would become so pale it would almost be translucent sometimes. and then coughing up blood. So through the 1800s, out of all of the deaths, about 25% of them every year were due to tuberculosis. And throughout the 20th century, it remained the leading infectious disease killer of young people. And so we'll talk about why that is in a minute, but we're going to talk a little bit about what it is. So this is our friend Shattuck, who put together the report about causes of mortality from 1842 to 1848. That was just one or two tables in this thick book. So he talks about this important table, which it wasn't really that important, but I think the part that is important is that it shows that the disease takes its subjects principally at the productive period of life, so from 15 to 60 years, the most precious and most useful season. In the ages 20 to 30, the beauty and hope of life, far more die than at any other ages. So this is a disease that is sad because it takes young people, and they're the ones who are most likely to die from it. So people were thinking, oh, maybe we can do something to help. Again, they didn't know how to treat it, but they were thinking, well, good fresh air, good food, and rest can only help, right? Seems good today. And so, I mean, they're not going to hurt. It's not like purging that might hurt you. So the first US Sanitarium was in New York. It was actually by someone who was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He went to this lake before there was a sanitarium there to die, but he didn't die. So then he became a doctor, and his whole life was to try to beat tuberculosis. And one of the things that he saw was happening in Europe were these sanitariums. So he made the first one in the US in a lake near somewhere in New York. What? Saranac Lake, yes. And the idea was that you would be outside most of the time because fresh air is good for you. So you would be resting. You wouldn't be running around, doing jumping jacks, but you would be sitting on the, looking out the lake. You'd be sitting in a rocking chair, looking out at the lake, resting, breathing in this fresh air. And the idea is that would really help you. It did help him. I don't know how many people it helped, but it was. I don't know that you could be cured, but you wouldn't necessarily die from it. You would just live with it, but it wouldn't take you. You would be able to live a normal life, but you would still have it, and it could still flare up. Yeah, it's contagious, so if you have it, you should be able to give it to other people. So, and actually one of the interesting things is, so this is a sanitarium in New York, but there were also some out in the West, in Colorado, Arizona, because it was thought that dry air was also really good for you. And also there were a few people that thought that the harder it was to get to where you were going, the better it was for you. So if you had a really hard journey to Utah, or Arizona, or Colorado, so much the better for you when you got there. When you got there, you were supposed to rest. But getting there was supposed to make you stronger. So Tuberculosis Today. This is the only disease that one of two diseases we're going to talk about where there really isn't a good treatment even today. There's no cure, there's not a good vaccination, and once you get it, there's not a lot that the doctors can do. So worldwide, there were more than 10 million new cases in 2016 and 1.3 million deaths worldwide from tuberculosis. And you can get it here in the US. I work at a hospital, and every year I'm supposed to go get my tuberculosis test just to make sure that I don't have it so that I can't spread it to other people. And today it remains worldwide the #1 killer from infectious disease. So even though we don't send people to sanitariums anymore, there's not a lot that we can do other than treat the symptoms. Where tuberculosis is mostly today is in primarily lower middle income countries, so ones that may not have infrastructure, ones that may have people living in more crowded or unsanitary conditions, because if you are living in those sorts of conditions, it's just easier to spread anything, no matter what it is. And this is the other disease for which we don't really have a good treatment or cure. We have a vaccination that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So this is the other disease that we don't have a great cure for. And so this, can you see it? You can't see it. The top, so this is the 2018, and then the 2 previous years flu epidemic. So the one on the top, the red one, you can see that we did have a really bad year last year. So this is the number of visits, so like to your doctor, maybe to the CVS Minute Clinic, that are reported to have influenza-like symptoms. So at its peak, it was about 5%. So still 5% of all visits isn't a ton of visits, but it was much higher than the previous 2 years. And so the vaccine didn't work very well this year. It's always a hit. And the influenza virus changes so quickly, it's really hard to know what it's going to be like in the next year when you're having to make the vaccines. So we probably all know the symptoms. How many of you actually got the flu this year? Have you gotten it before, and how did it compare?
It was horrible. I thought my husband and I were going to die. My daughter came.
I remember you now. Yes.
That is since I'm taking you to the emergency room now, and you were both diagnosed with flu.
Yes.
You were both so sick we didn't realize you were that sick.
Okay. So actually, I gave this talk once before at TR, and I remember she gave the same comment, so I remember now. But basically, what she said is that she and her husband were both so sick that someone came and made them go to the ER. They were so sick they didn't realize how sick they were until they got to the ER.
I got the flu and was just before Christmas break. I had to hold school down 2 days early. Everyone was sick.
So she got the flu right before the end of Christmas break, and they had to close school for 2 days. And this is in Chelmsford? At Stonehill College, because everyone was sick. So they got 2 more extra days of vacation. Anyone else? I didn't get it this year, but from what I've heard is that everyone that did get it, that it was just horrible. It was much more horrible than previous years. So the symptoms are fever, sore throat, runny or stuffy nose, headaches and muscle aches, fatigue, and there could also be vomiting and diarrhea. It's not typically, usually that's more of a stomach bug than the flu, but you can have it from the flu. So complications, if you have a chronic condition, it can get worse, especially if you have something like asthma. And pneumonia is something that, because a lot of people still die every year from the flu, and many of those are from pneumonia. So you get influenza, it opens the door to let pneumonia come in, and then pneumonia is what gets you and kills you. Also bronchitis, sinus infections, ear infections, and other things. It's not a fun thing to have. Most people that are healthy are not going to die though, which is the good news. Unless you lived 100 years ago. That's not so good. So the 1918 flu pandemic was interesting in a lot of different ways. There are 3 things that are unique about it. One is that it was really, really infectious, much more than your common one. So many more people got it that year just because it was spread so easily between people. So about 1/3 of the world had the flu that year. And then if you did get it, the death rate was 25 times higher than normal. In a normal year, about 0.1% of people who get the flu will die from it. In that year, 2.5% of the people that got the flu died from it. And when I say die from it, I'm also talking about the secondary infections like pneumonia, which is what killed most of them. So, 97% of the people survived, but the reason that it killed so many people is because it was so contagious that many more people than normal had it. So and then the third thing that makes it unique is that it killed the young people in the prime of life. 20 to 40-year-olds were the ones who died. Usually of pneumonia, and it was what they think today, they don't know for sure, they think today is that it targeted the immune system so effectively that it really turned it against itself. So people who had strong immune systems, the 20 to 40-year-olds, it worked against them to where it put their immune system into overdrive and killed them.
How long it lasted?
Like if you got sick, how long it lasted, or how long the waves lasted?
The pandemic itself, did it start in 17?
So there were 3 different waves, and the first one, there's no certainty about where it may have started. It may have started in Europe, it may have started in Kansas, it may have started in China. Depending which one of those you believe is a different starting point. But the 3 main waves that people think of are the spring wave of 1918, where it was really contagious. It was starting to mutate a little bit, but for the most part, it didn't have the high mortality rate. People would still die, and they were starting to see these pneumonia cases, but it was really known just because it was really contagious. Most of the people that died in September to December of 1918, and that's where not only was it really contagious, but it became a killer, a really big killer, especially of young people. The war was still going on, all kinds of troop movements going on. And then the third wave was in the spring of 1919. And some places it persisted until 1920. So the big part was 1918, but in places it persisted until 1920. And then it disappeared. So worldwide, 20 to 100 million people died, and more people are thinking it's closer to 100 million people. and that it went from everywhere. It went everywhere in September to December. My mom grew up in this little teeny tiny town in New Mexico, and she was visiting me about a year and a half ago when I was thinking about putting together this talk. She's like, it never came to Verdun. I'm like, I bet it did. And so her dad actually had helped put together this book about the history of Verdun. I just randomly opened it to a page, and it said that Grandma, I always forget her name, but the person who nursed everyone to health, was like, yep, she nursed a lot of people through the 1918 flu epidemic. I was like, yep, it went there. So it went everywhere. Actually, if you want to know more about, well, I'm going to finish this and I'll tell you how you can learn more about it. So about 28% of Americans contracted the flu in the fall of 1918, and well, throughout the epidemics of 1918 and 1919. About 500,000 died, in which in today's numbers would be about 1.5 million. Today, there's about 20 to 40,000 people that die of the flu in a given year. So you can see the difference between that and 1.5 million. The average lifespan fell by 12 years because so many of the young people died. Left lots of orphans, left lots of things went on. And everyone was affected. They may, like my mom, they may not know about it. Further, we found out that her grandfather was very, very ill and almost died of it. And we're really glad he didn't, because my grandpa wasn't born until later. But everyone was affected, and I also found stuff on my dad's side that he didn't know about. So someone brought up ahead of time that there was a flu, that there's a podcast that just came out. It's on Hub History, and if you just Google Hub History 1918 flu, you can listen to it. The first 40 minutes or so just talk about the impact of what it was, how it impacted Boston, and then the next 20 minutes or so were me talking and being interviewed about some of these stories to give it the personal touch. So if you're interested in that, you can Google Hub History. So I'm going to just go through this really fast. I live in Winchester. This is the annual town report published in 1919, but for the year 1918. You can see, and if you were to compare it to previous years, that the number of deaths due to influenza at the top right, and then pneumonia about halfway down, are much higher that year than they would have been in the previous years. Actually, no, influenza would be hard to tell, because influenza was not a reportable disease until 1918, meaning that you could report it if you wanted to, but you didn't have to until the fall of 1918. So it's actually hard to compare to previous years. But also you can see how many people were affected. So, I don't know, this isn't working anymore. If you look down about halfway, you can see on the far right it's about 1,200. So you can see that there were 500 cases. These are not people who died, these are just reports of influenza. 500 in September, 400 in October, 29 in November, and then it started up again in December with 276. So a lot of people, and Winchester's not a very big town, and it was a smaller town then. This is, I think, second to last one we're going to talk about. I'll go through these a little bit quickly. So this is the typhus fever, not to be confused with typhoid fever. It's not really around today much, but it was important historically. So since this is a genealogy talk, I wanted to include it. So often it was called epidemic typhus, so you might see that. Many think it's the same as jail fever because it's spread by lice. So you would see it in jails, you would see it in camps, any sort of camp, military camp, jail camp, any sort of, and so even though it's rare now, it killed millions in the previous centuries. And a lot of the symptoms are the same as what we've been seeing: a headache, chills, fever, coughing, muscular pain, dark spots that start on this is the part that's unique, starts on the upper trunk and then spreads throughout the body, and then confusion. And actually confusion could happen for some of these other ones. For the 1918 flu, there are actually a lot of people who were shown to have confusion either while they were sick or even afterwards, for months afterwards or maybe years afterwards. Up today, if you get it, there's up to a 40% mortality rate if it's not treated. So a lot of these are still pretty nasty today, but thankfully we have vaccinations and antibiotics that can help. So this is the last one we're going to talk about. This is cholera, and it's been in India for centuries. It was endemic in India for centuries. Didn't make it out of India until the early 1820s. That's when it started making it to Europe and to America, again through boats. And so in New Orleans in 1832 was one of the first big epidemics in the US, and there were about 4,000 to 5,000 deaths in 3 weeks. Later that year, it hit New York, and it didn't hit them as hard. They only had 3,000 deaths over a longer time period. And unlike most of the others, the newspapers really hyped this up, spreading the fear. Often they wanted to tamp it down and say, it's okay, we don't have an epidemic. So actually newspapers are not always a very good source if you're trying to search about epidemics, because during certain periods they would play it down, and other periods they would ramp it up.
Is this waterborne?
This is waterborne, yes. So it is a severe diarrheal illness. Most of the people who get it, about 90% I think, are going to have mild symptoms. They'll have a bad case of diarrhea for a day or two, then they're fine. But if you're in the lucky 5 or 10% to get the really bad case, you're going to have profuse diarrhea where you're losing up to a liter an hour. You can just imagine what that's going to do to your body to lose that much fluid. You can't replace it. They didn't have IVs or anything back then. They can't replace it. You would have leg cramps because all of your electrolytes were leaving your body. Vomiting would only add to the amount of fluid loss. And then there would be a blue tinge due to dehydration. And so if untreated, death could occur in hours from the severe dehydration and the shock that would come after that. Today, if it's untreated, the mortality rate can be up to 70%. So places, and it is waterborne, and so places that have had hurricanes, that have had wars, that have had other things that are going to upset the clean water situation, there's going to be cholera. And if treated, again, the mortality rate can be up to 70%. If untreated, up to 70%. If it's treated, and really the treatment is just to give an antibiotic to kill the bacteria, and then to give you fluids and electrolytes. It's pretty easy treatment. Skip over this. So the last outbreak in the US was in 1911. Today, worldwide, there are about 130,000 deaths out of 3 to 5 million cases. And again, these are going to be in places where they don't have clean water, whether it's a refugee camp, whether there was a hurricane or other natural disaster, whether there was a war. Any place like that that doesn't have access to clean water is going to have a cholera outbreak. So, in the colonial era, and up into the 1800s, and even into the 1900s, in the colonial era, few diseases were thought to be contagious. They knew the smallpox was contagious. They weren't sure about a lot of the other ones. But there were lots of reasons they thought they could cause diseases. Sin, miasma, which is a bad smell in air, the humors, and then it wasn't until bacterial and viral causes were found in the late 1800s, early to mid 1900s, that they actually were able to figure out what was really going on. And it wasn't really until well into the 1900s, the 1930s, 40s, before the death rates due to infectious disease in Massachusetts fell below 20%. So where can you look? Well, if you're lucky, you can look in annual town reports, if you happen to have those in your town. You can look at hospital reports, you can look at town histories, church and government records, and diaries and personal papers, cemeteries, newspapers. Although again, remember with newspapers often it was either purposely ramped up or personally played down. So they may not give you an accurate. So conclusions, life was dangerous before antibiotics and vaccines. We live in a good time right now. And fear was endemic as the epidemic started because they didn't know who it was going to take. It wasn't just going to take their kids usually, as terrible as that would be. But after the diseases became endemic, then again, you were going to lose a lot of kids during childhood, but if they survived childhood, then they were likely to survive the outbreaks. So, thank you for listening. I hope that was a whirlwind tour. But I hope that it gave you some good information. The syllabus has a lot of resources as well if you want to look at that. Yes.
Did you say a word about typhoid fever? Wasn't that another one? I noticed I've seen a couple of students from my family that are children in the 1880s on. Isn't there a lot of typhoid fever around, especially in populations?
So the question is about typhoid fever, and in her family, she's seen it, especially in the 1880s, that children were found, and wasn't it around a lot in immigrant populations? I would say, to not be confused with typhus fever. Typhus fever is borne by lice. Typhoid fever is waterborne or foodborne. So yes, it would, and again, anywhere where there's not great sanitation is where you would find much more typhoid fever.
What about rheumatic fever? Is that always a complication?
So is rheumatic fever always a complication? It was a complication of some diseases. I'm not sure if it was of all diseases. And it was around, and I actually have to honestly say I'm not exactly sure what it is. I should have looked it up, but Off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure what it is. Do you know?
Something that followed like strep, that we had a treated strep that you could get.
So the question, she thought that if you had strep and it was not treated, that you could then have rheumatic fever. We see that where it listed up on my slides was the complication of scarlet fever, which again is a throat disorder.
I was under the impression that you had rheumatic fever that quite often you're left with an underlying heart condition after your bout with the rheumatic fever.
So
That
her,
was one of the lasting effects.
So her comment is that if you got rheumatic fever after strep or scarlet fever or any other disease, that you probably had underlying heart conditions as well. And I believe that is true. In the back.
Just a comment, it looked like you had slided, like you said, it was John.
Do you want me to go back to that?
I happened to, a few weeks ago, I just finished listening to the audiobook, which you have here. So kind of a plug for the book or the audiobook. What an amazing thing. So it's the ghost map about this,
Yeah.
This outbreak of cholera in London. And at first they thought it was.
Yeah, actually, can I say it into the microphone? Is that okay?
Go ahead.
Well, but thank you for bringing it up. So she brought up the Ghost Map, which is a book that's come out recently and is a fabulous book about the cholera outbreaks in London. And this famous map is John Snow. And so he thought that it was waterborne, but no one knew this at the time. They thought it was due to miasma, and it was a poor part of town. And the reason they were all getting sick with cholera is because of the bad smells, not because of water. So what he started doing is these black spots here, he started mapping out where there was cholera in the houses. And it all centered around a water pump. And so once he made that really clear, the town shut down that water pump and the cholera disappeared from that area. It still popped up in other places. But he was really the first to show that it was waterborne and that if you shut down the water source, that you could shut down the epidemic. So the Ghost Map, an excellent book. Thank you.
Yeah, it was just, I saw that little flash.
Yeah.
So I can't help but think about AIDS. So do you think in 100 years someone's going to hear talk about AIDS?
Yes.
This cause versus
Yes, so her question is, she was thinking about AIDS, and in 100 years is someone probably going to give a talk like this and include AIDS, and I would think yes, they should. It's another, I'm actually more of a colonial historian, so even getting into 1918 was a little recent for me. But yes, AIDS actually in some of the books I've been reading, so I've given several talks about the 1918 flu epidemic, and in some of the books I've been reading, many of them compare it to AIDS and then say how it's different or not. But so that comparison is being made now for disease from 100 years ago. Oh yeah, and the whole stigma, were you contagious, were you not, how was HIV or AIDS really spread? Now we know, but before we knew, everyone was really scared that they could get it just by being next to someone who had it. Any other comments or questions?
I have a question about possibly diphtheria. I go to an island off the coast of New Hampshire, and in 1863 there were 3 young girls. There's a cemetery there with 3 young girls. And the story is that the older child was in school on the mainland. Could have been Rye, could have been Portsmouth, and she was sent home because she was sick. And then 2 of her siblings died. So there's a cemetery with 3 little girls stoned. So we always say, well, they don't know what it was, but we always say it was probably diphtheria. So this is in 1863. So is there any record of an 1863 outbreak?
Let me repeat the question first. So she does research, and there's this island in outside of New Hampshire,
Off the coast of New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, where in 1863 there was a family with 3 girls, maybe more, but 3 of them died. One of them had been going to school on the mainland. She got sick. She was sent home to the island. She then gave it to her 2 siblings. All 3 of them died, and so on this island there are now 3 graves for these 3 little kids. And her question is there a known outbreak of diphtheria in 1863? And for that, I would say you actually would have to do some research yourself in the area. There's not really, in the syllabus, there are some guidelines for some of the major outbreaks, but for something really local like that, you're gonna have to do some research yourself.
So it may be very local. You don't know of any more widespread.
Yeah, I think it was the main one that I know that was widespread is in the 1735 and 36. Although we do know that even in the 1770s, Abigail Adams was worried about it because again, it was going through town and she thought that her kids might get it. It popped up and went, but it wasn't, except for the 1735 to 1736 epidemic, I haven't really heard of it being widespread. It seemed to be more local.
Same point, I'm going to have to go back and look at the local history in Oneonta, New York. I've got a 38-year-old great-great-grandmother that died in 1884. Unfortunately, that was before they had good death certificates. But she had a 9-year-old daughter that died in the same year. So I've always kind of thought, well, there was probably something going, some kind of epidemic going through there. But you've convinced me I've got to go back, find my local historians in Oneonta and say,
So, yes. So I've done my work. He was talking about his family member, great-grandmother?
Yeah,
Great-great-grandmother who lived in Oneonta, New York. And she died, and then her 9-year-old daughter died the same year, but it was before there were good death records. He's always wondered if there may have been an epidemic, but he's going to have to go talk to, he knows now he's going to have to go talk to the historians.
I do have some contacts. So that's
Good, excellent. So some places you can look if you're trying is look into town histories, look in newspapers, not just the immediate ones, but like some of the surrounding places as well. Church records will sometimes have things. Any place that you can find something that might list, you know, that something unique was going on. Another place to look is cemetery records. If you're interested, you can email me at bridgingthepast@gmail.com, and I can send you the link. Is my email in here? Yes, so I do have some business cards in the back. And there's this place called History Camp, which happens once or twice a year. And the first one that I went to, there was a woman who discovered, I forget what kind of epidemic it was, but she was looking through the cemetery in her local town and she realized there were a lot of people dying this year. It didn't say what they were dying of, but there were just a lot of gravestones for this one particular year. So she dug further and she found that there was an epidemic, that it actually had started in Boston, and then when the soldiers were released from Boston and came back home, they brought it with them. So if you're interested in that, you can pick up one of my you can pick up my card at the back or email bridgingthepast@gmail.com and I can send you the link. So cemeteries are another good place. If a lot of people are dying in a given year, there was probably something going on. It's not going to tell you what, but it'll give you a sense that something was going on. Any other questions?
I tried to go back in our town in the colonial period.
Mm-hmm.
The town was founded in, incorporated in 1728. But I tried to find all the deaths because there wasn't the vital records around town that for everybody else's. So they're kind of patchy and everything. But I tried. One thing I kept finding was that soldiers in colonial wars, I mean, there'd be a couple, married couple, and then the husband would just disappear from the tax records, or you couldn't find him anywhere until you discovered that he was a soldier. But there was no report of his death or anything. And there isn't any, I don't seem to be any like military records of people dying,
No.
Many of them died with camp fever
Right.
rather than
Yeah.
battles,
Mhm. Yeah.
But there isn't any
No. Okay. So
unknown to me.
no.
Okay.
So her question is that she's trying to reconstruct a lot of the death records. So there's not death records. She's trying to create a list of the deaths in colonial New England in her town, and what she's finding is that a lot of people, there's this husband that all of a sudden disappears. She later finds that he was in the military, and she thinks he may have died, but is there any like one good place to go for that? The answer is no. You could try to look in regimental histories. You could try to find diaries of people from the area, that were in the same regiment. But there's not like one place that has all of the deaths.
Even things like when they had a will. I found one where the probate records said that he died in the battle with snowshoes, Rogers, but that was like the only one.
Yeah, no, you're not going to find them. But I just lost my train of thought. Oh, one good point is that up until the 1900s, and at least World War II, maybe later, I forget exactly. That was one of the wars in the 1900s was the first war where more people died of battle wounds than diseases. That more people died of diseases in most wars up until the 1900s than actually of battle. I'll come back to you. There's another question.
I have one more question about tuberculosis. Not being a medical person, I always thought it attacked the lungs. That's what you speak most. My grandmother died of tuberculosis, but it was sort of like an intestinal thing. Was that common or was that not?
Okay, so her question is that she, like most of us, thinks of tuberculosis as an attack of the lungs, and that is by far the most common type of tuberculosis. But there are other types it can. So she said someone in her family there was an instance of intestinal tuberculosis, and was that common? I don't think it was common, but it did happen. The tuberculosis could strike outside of the lungs. It just didn't happen all that often. Are there any other questions? Okay. So thank you very much.
I usually do this at the beginning, but I forgot. I have new member packets with all kinds of information for any new members. Who would like one?
Well, thank you very much for coming. Have a good one.